Good morning, colleagues, and welcome at our annual workshop for the Research Ethics Committee in the West Committees in the Western Cape. It's great to see so many of you online. We have been receiving the confirmations of attendance over the past couple of days, and it's great to see so many of you. We're still waiting for other people to join, but we have a very full program, so I think it's best if we start. And as you now all have seen our program, we will start by just a word of welcome from the director of our Division for Research Development, Dr. Terina Tron, who is, in a certain sense, the boss of us all on the REC. So don't look so shocked, Terina. Anyway, so Terina, yes, please, over to you.
Thanks very much, Len. Gosh, you give me a fright this time, this early in the morning. Yeah, it's an immense privilege and pleasure for me to be able to welcome all of you and to open this event. I can certainly assure you that I'm not going to speak for 15 minutes, Len. So I will really help you in your full program and help you to get on to the important discussions really quickly. But just to say that from Stellenbosch University side, it's really a pleasure for us to host this event. It's a wonderful event, annual event, which places research integrity and ethics at the forefront of our discussions around research, as it should be. And we had the wonderful privilege this year, of course, to also host the World Conference on Research Integrity in Cape Town. Many of us were there, and we were again reminded of the complexities that we have to deal with, and you certainly as research ethics members, committee members, have to deal with on a daily basis. And it's not getting less complex as time goes by. It's certainly becoming more complex. And I really want to thank you from my side on behalf of all the universities in the Western Cape, also for the immense task that you take on as research ethics committee members. We realize that it's an enormous undertaking, it's an enormous task, and it's an enormous responsibility. Um, so it really is wonderful to welcome you all to this event. Um, Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the dedication to your task as Research Ethics Committee members. And thank you also for helping all of us today to put our heads together around some really critical issues related to research integrity and ethics. You will certainly help us, Stellenbosch University, with your input to discuss really challenging issues around research integrity and ethics. And I do believe that there will be some really tangible outcomes from these discussions that we can apply in our everyday dealings with research integrity and ethics at the university. I'm also very pleased to see that there is a session on the well-being and how research ethics committee members cope with this enormous accountability resting on your shoulders. Um, we often deal with, I often at least deal with some of our, let's call them clients, our applicants who express some unhappiness around receiving comments from research ethics committee members or from research ethics committees, and also that the work that then they have to go back and do to improve their applications. And I always remind them of the fact that remember that when you speak about them and us, you are actually referring to your own colleagues, your peers, your colleagues who volunteer their time to undertake this immense task with all of that resting on their shoulders, in addition to all the other academic work that they need to do. So I know that it is stressful for people to serve on research ethics committees. I know that you often have to bat also for responsible research conduct, which is so important. And I thank you for that. And I really hope that you, all of you in particular, will also have the opportunity to take a good break over the upcoming festive season, and that you will recharge your batteries, and that we can really again count on you with your expertise and your dedication to carry on the good work in 2023. So I really wish you a very fruitful discussions this morning, and I will try to attend some of it, if not all. And I really hope that the outcomes of this discussion will be very useful to all of you, and that you will be able to apply it going forward. So with that, Len, over back to you. I really wish you a good event, and I will try to listen in as much as I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terina, for that warm welcome. And I always say that, you know, with sometimes with the kickback that we get, it's always good to know that you have our backs also in the work that we do. Colleagues, yes, as I said, we've got quite a full program. Thank you very much to our REC coordinator at the REC SBE for teasing out all these important themes for us to discuss and to make sure that everyone is on board and everyone is happy with the relevance and the importance of the themes that we are going to discuss. So the program is quite full. I just want to add at this point a couple of housekeeping rules for this meeting. So at the start of each session, the session facilitator will introduce the speakers and will coordinate the question and answer sessions at the end, the session at the end. We will keep the microphones and the videos camera inactive during the webinar, but we will activate your microphone and video camera when you raise your hand during the Q&A session. Then a request from the presenters and from the coordinators is to please post comments or questions to the speakers in the chat. Aidan will, of course, there will be a chance also for live questions, but our one colleague, Aidan Williams, will monitor the chat in any case, and he will share a summary of the questions and comments with the session facilitator at the end to help with that process. Now, you may hear the event team interrupt a presenter during their presentation to alert them to the 5-minute or 2-minute mark of their session so that we can keep the event on schedule. So we've checked this with our presenters and they don't seem to mind. So thank you very much for that. Then, colleagues, after the event, Clarissa will send the assessment form to you, which you must please complete for CPD points. As well as a separate evaluation form. These need to be completed by Wednesday, the 30th of November, as assessment form will close then. So just a kind request to also complete that for us. Colleagues, so yes, we are 5 minutes before our official time, but I think all of the presenters will be happy if we can score a couple of minutes in the process. So for the first session, I'm now handing over to the facilitator, who is my colleague on the REC, our Vice Chair, Professor Ilana van Wyk. Ilana, please, over to you.
Thank you, Len, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Stellenbosch, even if it's online. It's my great pleasure to introduce this session in which we're going to talk about race. Very first up will be Professor Len Hansen. You just saw him now. Len is a systematic theologian, and he specializes in Christian spiritualities and theological research methodology. He serves as the Director of Research in the Faculty of Theology, and as a member of the REC SBE for the last 10 years. He's also our chair. I'm also speaking in this session, so it's a bit weird to introduce myself, so I hope you bear with me. I'm an anthropologist at Stellenbosch, and I've taught at a number of universities, among them the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, the London School of Economics, Pretoria University, and UCT. I used to be an editor-in-chief of Anthropology Southern Africa, so I had to deal with a lot of these ethical issues. And I currently serve as the vice chair of the REC SBE, the Social Behavioural Educational Research at Stellenbosch. And then it's our great pleasure to also welcome in this session Professor Jonathan Jansen. I'm sure most of you know of Professor Jansen. He's a distinguished professor of education at Stellenbosch University and president of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He's a curriculum theorist, and his research is concerned with the politics of knowledge. His most recent book, and as you know, there's a lot of them, is The Decolonization of Knowledge, and it was published by Cambridge Press with Cyril Waters. He started his career as a high school science teacher and holds a PhD from Stanford University. He holds an A1 rating from the National Research Foundation and has 4 honorary doctorates. So in this session, we are first going to talk about that colored study. And I'm going to hand over to Len for that, and I'll chip in at the end, and then we'll have Professor Jansen present. So Len, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Ilana. Let me just share my screen. Right. Can you see that, Clarissa? Is that good?
It's a bit small, but I think our attendees can use the pop-out content feature to just enlarge the screen.
Oh, okay. All right. Right. So, colleagues, yes, I think one cannot, speak of the HREC SBE, at least at Stellenbosch University, without knowing about or without referring to what we've been calling since then the article, which was an experience that the HREC had 3 years ago, and I think that we've learned a lot from, and which still requires our attention and our constant reflection. And we thought it would be a good idea to start this, also given the recent Kampepe Commission report in our on the university, all of that, which is kind of part of the story of Stellenbosch and part of what we are talking about today. Right, so in April 2019, it was a time that the management of Stellenbosch University and its academics and most of its students and alumni will remember as one of outrage, disappointment, and yes, also of shame. In the middle of all this uproar was the Stellenbosch University Ethics Committee for Social, Behavioural and Economic Research. The story of the article broke when a colleague from a sister university read an article published by 5 Stellenbosch University researchers in its Department of Sports Science. In March 2019, it appeared in the journal Aging, Neuropsychology and Cognition. According to the abstract of the article, coloured women in South Africa have an increased risk of low cognitive functioning as they present with low education levels and unhealthy lifestyle behaviours. The study assesses the cognitive function and its association with age and education in a sample of young and middle-aged coloured South African women. The group of 60 between the ages of 18 and 64 were included in the study. And as an aside, the participants were all from Cluttersville, a historically coloured area in Stellenbosch. The overall conclusion of the article was that coloured women in South Africa have increased risk of low cognitive functioning as they present with low education levels and unhealthy lifestyles. It was reported in the media that the colleague who first reacted to the article, as soon as she began reading it, was surprised by the language it used. Even the title and the abstract set alarm bells ringing. She later tweeted, When racism is embedded in our worldview, epistemology, and academic structure, this is the outcome. How do you look your coloured colleagues and students in the eye? As said, the responses to the above critique of the article were immediate. The colleague who first raised the concern herself started an online petition and wrote to the journal calling for the removal of the article. This petition was signed in 7 days by more than 10,000 people. From then on, the response to the article escalated and was joined by voices not only within the academic community, but also beyond it. Across the media, the article and the response was reported under headlines such as Stellenbosch study on coloured women draws on colonial stereotypes. Paper by South African academics raises spectre of racism in the academy, and race haunts the halls of Stellenbosch University. Of course, within the academic community, the reaction was fierce, and the article was condemned by scholars across South Africa. Professor Leslie Lagrange of Stellenbosch University summarized the main points of critique from the academic community against the article as that the article smacks of racial essentialism, that the authors committed perennial error evident in biomedical sciences research to connect race with medical conditions, that the research has methodological flaws, including its sample size, that the findings of the research is painful to women who were designated colored during apartheid and has elicited anger, that the research is a product of an institution that has a long history of producing racial science, and that there is an enduring racism in science, and that serious questions should be asked about the peer review and calls for revisiting the processes that the research was subjected to, including the work of the Research Ethics Committee at Stellenbosch University. The reaction to the article was also not limited to academic circles. The Division for Research and Methodology of the Psychological Society of South Africa issued a critical review statement asking for the retraction of the article. The article was also condemned by the ANC in the Western Cape, calling for the intervention of the Gender Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and the Minister of Higher Education, and the article even was mentioned in Parliament itself. Of course, the article required a response from the university and how it sees racial categories, and especially the use of such categories in research at the institution. Students too voiced their opposition to the article in the media, and this included, for instance, heartfelt response to coloured women, to coloured South African women study and research on coloured women. I hang my head in shame, both by students of colour from the university, that was published in the media. Stellenbosch scholars also strongly reacted to the article in their personal capacity or as groups. On the 22nd of May, 13 senior academics at the university submitted a motion for discussion of the issue and the article at Senate. The symposium was also held the day before on restructuring science and research at Stellenbosch University on the basis of justice, inclusion, and ethical integrity. The symposium was attended by 160 people, and Professor Aslam Fattar from the university opened the symposium with a statement by the organizers that our intention is to offer a space for in-depth and critical deliberation about the core dimensions of the so-called race and cognition article elicited. We are interested in developing alternative approaches to the gratuitous use and misuse of race in science and research. We especially wish to debunk it as an instrument used to discriminate against people and undermine their dignity. The rector, Professor Wim de Villiers, who was overseas at the time, shared a message to the participants stating that this single piece of research in no way reflects the ethics, quality, and values of Stellenbosch University's stellar research program, but it does serve as a reality check for our institution. A similar symposium titled Race as a Variable in Scientific Research, Controversies and Concerns was also hosted in May 2019 by the Faculty of Health Sciences and Medicine at the Tygerberg campus. This was attended by 450 people. On 24 April, the university had already issued a statement on the issue. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Studies in particular expressed concern about the pain and anger the article has elicited within the academic community and broader society. In it, he also referred to the ethical clearance processes followed by the university, to the university's commitment to academic freedom and critical scientific debate, but also to scrutiny of researchers by fellow researchers not only to determine its suitability for publication in accredited journals, but also in the public domain. For many people, in all of these reactions, the elephant in the room was, how did this research, funded by the NRS, pass both internal journal review processes and institutional ethics review? The HREC SBE was, of course, a major target of much of the speculation and critique in the media. HREC members themselves were shocked by the article and faced the question of, how did we pass this research? We are a well-functioning HREC with thorough processes, trained reviewers, and a multiple of institutional and extra-institutional policies to guide us and that we have to follow. What went wrong? This question was also foremost in the minds of the university management, who undertook to launch an investigation on this. The HREC, via the Research Integrity Officer of the university, was thus required to report on the process, the decisions, and the reasoning behind the HREC's approval of the research. Now, time does not allow to go into the report in any detail, so a summary of the findings must suffice. But the HREC submitted its report on the review to the Research Integrity Officer on 17 May 2019, in which it stated that the article published under the title Age and Education-Related Effects on Cognitive Functioning in Coloured South African Women is the outcome of a medium research project, the relationships between lifestyle factors, cardiometabolic health, cognitive functioning, and cardiorespiratory fitness in South African women from a low socio-economic community. In the HREC's investigation, it was found that the study presented in the article differs substantially from the protocol submitted to the HREC for ethics review. In particular, the article focused on the race of the participants, and it implies that race was one of the inclusion criteria for participation in the study. While this was nowhere mentioned in the ethics application or the supporting documents, including the recruitment material and consent forms. In light of the above, the researchers, the committee found, contravened the university's policy for responsible research conduct by deviating from the approved protocol and by publishing research that did not have a valid scientific methodology, that it did not ensure that research participants are well informed about the purpose of the research and how the research results will be disseminated, and it did not ensure the fair selection of participants. No amendments or deviation reports linked to the approved protocol were also ever submitted to the HREC. The committee, therefore, made some recommendations, and these include the retraction of the article, an official apology to the community whose members were recruited to participate in the study, the continuation of the discourse on and the conscientization of students and colleagues on the use of racial categories in research. And a final request was for the university management to exonerate the HREC SBE in the media of any dereliction of duty in its review of the project that resulted in the publication of the article. So the article was retracted, but in a sense, this was only the beginning of the story, for the HREC at least. And for the rest of the story, I now hand over to my colleague, Ilana. Please, Ilana, so over to you.
Thank you, Len. Yes, the whole issue of the article was definitely a traumatic one for the members of the HREC SBE, whose own research ethics and expertise were questioned by colleagues, by students, fellow scholars outside the university, and also by wider society. We were continued being asked, how could we allow this? And the question continued to haunt us as recently as 2021, when two researchers published an article in which they asserted, with no proof and with no reference to the report on the HREC that Len just told you about, that the HREC was fully informed about the terms of the study and wrongly gave it the go-ahead. And they proceeded then to eviscerate our complicity to the study and our racism. We, of course, had to respond, but the question continues to haunt us, as it would, I think, any other university. For one, this question about the HREC's competence did nothing to increase the willingness of colleagues to join the HREC as a voluntary committee of Senate. We were definitely damaged by it. Within the HREC, it also led to deep introspection and attempts to prevent this from ever happening again. And some of these attempts were a little bit cack-handed, as you would imagine. And one of them was to classify all research on people structurally marginalized by apartheid, and that's the words used at the time, another way to talk about race in South Africa, as medium risk research. And as you know, medium risk research has all kinds of extra care involved. Now, at the time, I was outside of the HREC. I wasn't part of it yet. And I was extremely alarmed at this attempt to deal with the issue, as in my mind, it confused the reasons why researchers should be held to standards of care usually reserved for people who are unable to freely consent to research. Our usual reason to classify research as medium risk, with an institutional concern about its reputation. That's how I read it. As an anthropologist, I was alarmed that all social research in our racialized society would suddenly become medium risk research. I wrote a long explanation to the HREC for why I thought this was not only wrong-headed, but racist. In one stroke, I said the HREC would be suggesting that people once classified as Black, coloured, Indian, and Asian in South Africa were unable to freely consent to research and should be in the same category as imprisoned people, minors, and people who are mentally unable to understand the terms of consent. And I think that would be extremely racist. Luckily, the HREC agreed with me and it dropped its plans on this score. And as no good deed goes unpunished, they asked me to join the HREC. So it is in this position that I've often been part of conversations about research that rely on race as a category. And our deliberations are ongoing, and every now and again, we get an application that leads to another round of questions, deliberations, and introspection, and it's an ongoing process. These issues were heightened yet again with the promulgation of the new POPI Act, and I'm sure all of you have been haunted by this act, that specifically requires researchers to reflect, at least on our HREC applications, on the use of demographics, including race. So this is how we as a HREC deal with race, or how we see race. And I'm generalizing here, but this is sort of our starting points. Respected voices from the fields of human molecular biology and physical anthropology, supported by research on the Human Genome Project, assert that the concept of race has no validity in their respective fields. So with them, we then assert that there's no biological basis to race. So there's no racial genetic marker that can set someone apart as Black, white, or coloured, to use the South African racial terminology. There's no pure white person, for instance. But with geneticists, we also acknowledge that groups of people could have common ancestry, which could lead to certain predispositions to disease, for instance. All right, so we do accept that geneticists, for instance, can work on this common ancestry business. But, and this is important, that ancestry is not homogeneous, or it can lead us to a definition of racial groups. So you can't use this ancestry to define who is Black, who is white, who is coloured, and so on and so forth. In essence, we are against racial essentialism, i.e. that racial classifications have any kind of explanatory power. For instance, that because you're white, you're X, Y, and Z. So that is off the table altogether for us. This doesn't mean that we deny the importance of constructed racial categories in the experience of people we research. And in a racialized society like our own, we can very clearly see that playing out. A large body of social science research documents the role and consequences of the apartheid government's racial categories on primary social institutions and environments, including criminal justice, education and health systems, job markets, and where people live. In this system, race served as a basis for the distribution of social privileges and resources, and unfortunately continues to do so. So we think as a HREC that it's important to do systematic investigation to uncover and distinguish what social forces, including race, the constructed category of it, contribute to these disparate outcomes in society. So race is not off the table, but you need to make sure that you point out that this is a socially constructed category and so on and so forth. But, and this is important for us, in accepting the social constructedness of race, and its abiding influence on the ways in which people experience their lives, we remain that these categories change over time. So our researchers need to indicate that as well. And it's in this respect that we sometimes come across applications that give us pause. When researchers, for instance, confuse social and racial categories. So naming people who identify, and this is just one example, who identify as Bushman, San, Khoisan, as coloured. So we've had a few applications where the researchers insist that even though people themselves identify in terms of these social categories not as coloured, they insist that these people are really coloured. And it's at that point that we as a HREC draw a line and we say, if people publicly reject that category of persons for themselves, what does this add to the research or to the question to say that you know better, that you can classify them as coloured? Why is it necessary to go to race? So in those kind of cases, it's pretty clear to us that race should not be part of the categories used in the research. More difficult, and I think this is something that that leads us to other kinds of questions, are when we are faced with what Professor Janssen recently called the continuing influence of racial studies light, where people or researchers assume that social categories of people of different races are socially contained, that race is the primary category of social identification, and that it has some kind of explanatory power. So we, you know, there are whole fields where this is still true. And in these cases, we often try to engage the researchers and question specific instances of problematic assumptions, right? But we get a lot of pushback from supervisors, and we get references to other racial studies saying, you know, this is true in our field, this is accepted practice. And in those cases, it's harder to draw as an ethics committee to put a stop to those kind of studies, and we try to then pass them and engage the researchers, but to stop that kind of research is much harder. And then we have the problem of dealing with the legacies of racial studies themselves, the studies that were set up during colonial and apartheid eras, the collections of bones held in our university collections, and most universities in the Western Cape have these collections, and these collections are often classified on racial bases, right? So we have applications from scholars asking to study the bone osteology of coloureds, for instance, on a coloured collection. And in that study, it's really hard to, first of all, make the researcher aware of the fact that this study or the collection was based on racial science, that it violently assigned racial categories to people, that no consent was given by the people who were included in the collection or their families, and that there are massive problems around it. So, you know, we have to kind of straddle this problematic between the social and the scientific. And as I said, what do we do with these collections, and what do we do with researchers who are asked to do research on these collections? How do we deal with race in them? How do we get researchers to think more closely about the ways in which they go about studying race when this is a collection held by a university? So there are also these grey areas that we struggle with, that we kind of push back, and we try to engage our researchers more clearly. But as I said, you know, in some of these fields, race is still something that determines how people frame their studies. And as a social educational research committee, sometimes these studies land on our doorsteps, and it's hard to then engage with researchers who treat these as not constructed, but as biological realities. And that brings me to the limits of our mandate. So research ethics committees such as ourselves are, and this is from an anthropological point of view, are embedded in educational institutions and in societies. So we are part of societies, and so are our researchers. So they participate in these ideas that are very common in society. And the question is then, what is our role? And as Professor Anisha van der Merwe used, she said, we are one of the gentle gatekeepers of sound scientific and ethical research as planned, and not the police force of science. So we can only do so much. We are only at one point that we can influence, maybe shape, and in some cases, as I said, where people use a race instead of social categories such as self-identified ethnic category, we can stop those. Or we can say you can't use race. But this is where we stop. Our work stops at the review stage, and we cannot be held responsible for what research is published. And I think, as Len showed with the coloured women study, we could only review what we saw on the paper, what was given to us. And we cannot then go and review what people publish. That would make an impossible task for any ethics committee to also go and read what people have done with the research that we have cleared. The context in which we do research is constantly changing as well. So while we review at this planning stage, that context changes constantly. As I said, new legislation, as I mentioned, the POPI Act, and new laws protecting privacy and data constantly come in the ways in which we have to look at data. And it's led, in our case, to a whole section of new questions in our online application form, the POPI Act specifically, which our researchers have to tick. And it has an inevitable downside that applications are becoming longer. They're more time consuming and more complicated for users and a lot less friendly for them to follow. So in many cases, this issue about how we deal with race becomes a box ticking exercise. And our researchers have to tick the box that they have used the demographic personal information, tick the box, and then they have to explain why they use it. And very often we find slightly problematic ways in which people describe why they use race. And it's there that we can kind of, intrude and say something, but it's extremely hard for us to at every point kind of foresee how research would write this up. So we become, I wouldn't say overcautious, but definitely more cautious than we used to be, which is a good thing. Absolutely.
2 minutes, Ilana.
Thank you very much. And sometimes this feels like we're feeding a monster, this bureaucracy around how to deal with it, and that the machine that we bring to the question is more of a mallet than a careful parsing that scholars usually do. And we constantly calling for more and more training, but the problem with training is it is just as blunt, and that I think much more productively, and we're very glad to now have an increased body of people on our REC, that I think that the more careful work can be done in these committees, on the REC committee, where we have people who are specialists in social sciences, law, and so on and so forth, and in the conversations that we have with one another, that we can pass what it is, how we deal with race, how we carefully deal with, how we ethically deal with race, rather than instituting more and more bureaucratic categories that we can tick and answers that full format. I think it's in these conversations, in this kind of training, that we can do much more work, and that we are doing much more to push out how we can still have race on the table, because it is something that influences our society, that has an impact on the ways in which people live, rather than have these kind of formulaic box-ticking exercises that we see. So we're trying to balance this conversation with what the law and requires us to do on the online forms. And it's a balancing act, and it's something we don't always get right, and that we're constantly working towards. And on that point, that's it from me. I'm going to now hand over to Professor Jonathan Jansen, who will be speaking to us on ethics and the use of race and other social constructs in the health and social sciences. Professor Jansen, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to do, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Okay, thank you.
So what I'm going to do is just quite a bit of what Ilana said makes a lot of sense, and I might cover some of that ground. But let me just, but there's also one or two things that I just want to politely disagree on, because I think the thing we're dealing with here is a little bit more complicated than we think. So let me start off, and Emily's in the background flipping my slides for me. I was just going to talk without slides, but then I realized there's too much in each statement I want to make. and so I should let it hover on the screen as I speak. So the first thing I want to say is that you got to work from the assumption, not the assumption, I mean the obvious, and that is that Stellenbosch University is a former white Afrikaans university that is, to this day, quite deeply conservative in its understandings of race, of science, and of society. So my starting point is it's going to be difficult dealing with these issues. In the historically Afrikaans universities, issues of science and race and science lingered much longer in the public, in the publications, for example, that came out of these institutions than it did at a WITS or a UCT, and so on. So 100 years ago, all of these universities published the same offensive research, but gradually the UCTs and the WITSs, Rhodes's and so on, deviated from that fairly global trend at the time, which was to assume, for example, that Black people were less intelligent than white people. That all universities did that. But the Afrikaans universities didn't give up on that as easily. And so to this day, you would see, research, as you heard in the skeletal collection in Tygerberg, that proceeds as if nothing was wrong. Whereas the Raymond Dart collection at WITS, for example, took a completely different swing away from racial science decades ago. So you've got to assume that you're working with an institution, not just an organization, but an institution whose value set and belief system around issues of race is so deeply embedded. And I know that because I came here from other universities, and I was quite struck by the consensus among so many of my colleagues, whom I love very much, about issues of race and science. Anyway, what then is the responsibility of a research ethics committee, HREC as I heard the acronym, and so on. So let me go to the next slide. And the first thing I want to say about the so-called Colored Women study, it was of course tragic, but it was also a blessing in disguise. It brought the issue of race to the table when it had longed for a long time, even to this day, as I'll prove to you in a minute, assumed the status of common sense in institutional practice. So when I walk around on campus and I talk to people, white and for the sake of this context, colored, they talk to me about colored people as if their identity is real. And because after a while, you just give up, trying to convince people because it's emotionally quite exhausting. And you just sort of see this is such common sense. So in a way, I wasn't surprised, as I've said before, by the Colored Women study happening, but I was glad it happened because it was a way of bringing an underlying SORP, to expose it so that we can talk about it like today, and so on. So, but don't underestimate. Especially, I grew up on the other side of Cape Flats, on the other side of the N2. And so I travel. I'm now back in the southern suburbs of Cape Town, and I travel to Stellenbosch for to my office. And for those of you who know both sides, will know it's night and day, culturally, intellectually, politically, and so on. Stellenbosch is quite isolated. It was isolated from the Congress movements, the PNC and the ANC. It was relatively isolated from jazz clubs and brothels. It was isolated from the kinds of transgressive practices, both intellectually and socially, that you would not find in another university town in the world. And so that conservatism, that you'll see the DA response to the Campepe report around Afrikaans. It's absolutely bizarre that they would even not just misinterpret the report, but understand that in Stellenbosch you can stir that ethnic Afrikaans pot, okay, and get away with it. They would laugh at you if you were in Wetton or Lansdowne or Manenberg or what's next. This would be a joke, you know, but not in Stellenbosch. So don't underestimate the fact, and that's why I was glad, sad for the women involved, obviously, but intellectually at least happy that it came to the fore. Next slide. When just in the wake of the tragedy of the Niveau study, the institutional response to the crisis was quite disconcerting to me at the time, from the Vice Rector's office and everywhere else, which was the moment you see the word race in research, you block the research, you put it on hold. And is Ilana correctly, correctly said, that is a very dangerous move, because there is a way of talking about race, okay, that is progressive, that is open-minded, that is transformative, that would suffer if you, because of fright, because of ideological fright, you solely shut down any dissertation, any publication, any proposed research project because you saw the word race there or colored. So what I want to show you is how you speak about race is almost more important than whether you speak about it at all. So what can Stellenbosch University, HREC or HREC, do to deal with race? Next slide. That does two things. And that is to obviously protect human subjects, but also to advance or create space for progressive research. And the first thing I want to say, and forgive me if this was already said before I came online, you need as REC members to educate yourself about the meanings of race in research, both in the social sciences and humanities, but also in the natural sciences, the biomedical sciences, the engineering sciences, and so on. New members, of course, of your RECs will come and go, and this means that you have to constantly train and retrain, especially in basic social science concepts such as race. So this is, I'm doing now what I tell my students not to do, which is to read your slides too, and with eyes. But this is so important that I want to do it slowly. Now, if this knowledge that colleagues have of race and research was simply intellectual knowledge, or simply locked up in the cognitive, mind, then it's relatively easy to train. But this knowledge is also, as I said in Knowledge in the Blood, my book, it's emotional knowledge. It's knowledge that is very deeply held. So if you, since the day you were born, grew up with the notion that there are 4 races, you're not going to change your mind in a workshop. And so on. And so you have to constantly come back to this. And when Professor Terre Blanche, for example, appeared on that TED Talk show in the wake of that article with Lester Kibbe, the thing that struck me is that, and I believe her, by the way, is she couldn't understand what the fuss was about. What is it? Here's a person with a PhD, with years of training, research, what have you, who cannot even see the blatant racism in the work that they produce. And that is the problem. And that is why this is not going to go away, regardless of what we do as a REC, very easily. But at least we can start somewhere. And one way I suggest here is you have to educate yourselves on the meaning of race as research. Number 2, next slide. I came on when Ilana was speaking, so I know this is something she also said, but you must convey the understanding of race as a social construct, or you put our university at grave risk, okay? It is not a scientific. And if you want the detailed argument for that, please see the book that I put together with Cyril Walters, The Wake Up the Crisis, called Fault Lines. And there the geneticists make the point very persuasively that, that the variation, genetic variation within groups is actually greater than between groups. And so that in and of itself, given that we share more than 99% of a common genetic material, The hell are we still talking about races as if they're real? Race is made up. There are books with titles like How the Irish Became White, because white was not a color. White was a social status, an economic status. Afrikaners, or the Boers as they were called at the time, and the Brits spoke about each other as two separate races because the Brits looked down as lesser people, as a lesser race, and so on. So unfortunately, here's a generation of South Africans who really have come to believe there's an Indian, there's a colored, there's a white, there's a black African. And once you go down that road as a human being, once you go down that road as a scientist, once you go down that road as a REC member, you're dead in the water. People will laugh at you. People laughed at us after the study for our backwardness. And I'm a very proud member of the Stellenbosch community. It hurts, and you have to work out. Now, I know this is a very complex, sounds simple, race is a social construct, right? But this is something, if you've never heard it before and you've never been trained in it, and you read books about it, like Ian Goldberg's book on the construction of colored identity, then it's very difficult just in a talk like this to persuade you. But I'm asking you to at least stop and think about what this means. There's no other country in the world that had a legal category called colored. We imposed it on Zimbabwe and Namibia, but no other country in the world, they laugh at us, because of our senselessness around insisting on for such identities. As my friend Herman Chilumi correctly said, in the context of Stellenbosch, that segregation wasn't necessary, wasn't imposed because colored and white people were different. It was enforced precisely because they were so much the same. Number 3, saying that race is not real, in other words, that it is a social construct, doesn't mean that its uses do not have real consequences in the lives of human beings. Let's just take Stellenbosch for a moment. But you can go anywhere in South Africa with this. I'm always struck when I come into Stellenbosch that there is a Kaya Mandi where no white people there. That there is a Ida's Valley and a Clutisville, so-called colored people. That there is the fancy golf estates and wine estates and what have you, and the roads through Stellenbosch itself, where white people live. And you fool yourself if you don't think that race doesn't have consequences in society, such as patterns of residential occupation. And so on. Same with schools. I mean, there's a big difference between a Paulus and a Bloemhof, compared to, all these other schools that constructed for so-called colored students and the like. So spend some time trying to understand this very, very powerful quote that I've used in one of our books, where it says race is a fiction that draws real blood. There's 2 parts to it, of course. One is that race is not real, but the second is that it does real damage in the lives of people and so on. Then, what are some distinctions? I want to be practical here for you guys as a REC or RECs. What distinctions are therefore to be made between the way race is used in regressive ways and in progressive ways? How would you know the difference? I'm going to give you a few examples. These are examples, next page, slide, of the regressive ways in which race can be used, in which you as a REC can be alerted to. When somebody writes that colored women present with low education levels and unhealthy lifestyle behaviors, I hope you don't need to think about this. I hope you recognize that this is extremely offensive to people classified as colored, that it's a hopeless generation. And in fact, that 5 white women could do this, is beyond me, that not one of them said, Wachabuti. What shit is this? Okay, but there was no consciousness for all 5 of them. It was one person who wrote this, I could sort of, I suppose, understand. But all 5 of them were cahoots, intellectually speaking, coming up with this dribble, in the name of science. And boy, did it cause damage, but we don't need to use that example alone. This is what I see in Stellenbosch research, but to this bloody day, okay? Research that says colored people are more susceptible to tuberculosis. Now, I tell you why this is dangerous, okay? This is dangerous, A, because it suggests only colored people get TB, number one. Number two, it suggests the reason for the tuberculosis lies in being colored, which is nonsense. The reason for tuberculosis lies in your socioeconomic circumstances, where you live in a damp place with poor ventilation. That's how you get TB, in addition, of course, to genetics. But not saying that, makes people read this. This is one that was written literally a couple of years ago. Among nulliparous women, that is women who haven't given birth yet. African women have stronger pelvic muscles than whites and coloreds. Now let's assume for a moment that this is true, which I don't for a moment buy into. But let's assume for a moment that some idiot went and actually measured the pelvic muscle strength of African women, white women, and colored women, right? Why is this intellectually of any significance whatsoever, apart from the fact that it is socially repugnant? Why? Of all the things you could spend research time and money on, why this shit?
Professor Jansen, apologies for interrupting, just 5 minutes.
Okay. Indians get stomach ulcers. Afrikaners have dangerous cholesterol levels. And my favorite from the University of Free State, by a black guy, by the way, under a white supervisor, of course. Sesotho women differ in their dreams of those of colored. Unbelievable. Here's another one. But this is 2020. This is the other day. An MSc thesis from our university on the effects of alcohol on the gut biome. As you know, there's a whole study of TB studies that studies the stools of colored people and also white people and so on. But the gut biome in a sample of colored women. And yeah, I don't obviously now have time. I thought I had more time, but anyway. I'm just going to go to the crux of this article, which I studied in prep for today. This person's intellectual interest is to examine the effects of alcohol on the microbiome, the gut microbiome. Okay, so that's fair enough. That's a fair study among pregnant women. And then the person says this, out of the blue, informed consent was obtained from 86 pregnant women belonging to the South African colored population. I mean, can I ask you, as an RDC, why did you not pick this up at the Faculty of Health Sciences? Why? This comes after the Nivert study, right? And that was my sort of quibble with Ilana. Can deal with this Nivert study, but the stuff is so deeply enrooted in what I call common sense. It's very difficult. This is 2020 for evidence sake. Here's some progressive examples of how you could use as I move to a close. When Tumbly talks about the social construction of colored identity, often in sociology, the starting point is you're dealing with race as fiction. So that's good. When study talks about the career trajectories of Black PhDs in mathematics, my friend who's among us doing the study, this is a study that recognizes the Black experience is real, not as biological, but in a positive way, as in Black consciousness. Okay. The literature of the Indian diaspora in Mauritius and South Africa, a friend of mine was doing this study. And obviously, Indian isn't being used in a racial or ethnic sense, it's being used in a geographical sense, given where people started in the world. So going forward, what can you do? Number one, next slide. As I already said, you have to train and retrain your RDCs on how to deliberate on race. Next slide. You really have to workshop guidelines, and this, Clarissa, is something I strongly suggest you do. Develop a page or two of guidelines for the faculties, for the departments, for the centers and units around the university campuses. for how to think about race in research in dissertations, but also in faculty proposals for research. I would be very happy to be part of a team with Ilana and others to actually develop that 2 or 3 page document. Not to tell people what to do, you can't tell that to university academics, but you can give them guidelines on how to think the way we've talked about it so far today. Finally, workshop some test cases among yourselves. And I always develop 3 provocative cases and see whether the REC, both at the institutional level, so the faculty level, can agree as to what is offensive and what is not, so that you have a common understanding about the race in research and how to use it in your studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jansen, for a very insightful and provocative talk. If you don't mind, we have 20 minutes for some questions, and we already have 2 in the chat. One is by Dr. Herman Swart. Herman, would you like me to read it out? Or would you just ask the question yourself? Herman, I'm just going to ask the question. Oh, here we go. Herman asks, his question was, as researchers, we might, hold on. Professor Jansen, how do we think about those individuals for whom a colored identity, for example, is both psychologically real, i.e. they self-identify as such, and psychologically meaningful, i.e. they claim pride in their colored identity? This is from Herman Swart.
Well, I think in society as a whole, there's nothing you can do about that. You know, when I meet with my family, I mean, they think I'm nuts, you know, for saying this kind of thing. And you go into Manenberg or Lavender, you know, of course, you're going to find people who say they're proud of being colored, just like you find the same people celebrating this thing called the Coons, the Cape Carnival, you know, which is really historically a way of making fun of colored people. Etc. So there's nothing you can do about that as a university. What you can do as a university is to set guidelines for what research you think is acceptable and what is offensive. That obviously is the way in which we deal with this. But as an institution, the problem with the broader society, of course, is we're still so segregated in where we live, in how way we worship, in where we send our kids to school, and so it's very difficult, as I said, to shift that common sense. But at least while we're in university, we can begin to set some parameters for doing research that is not offensive, because the consequence of thinking about these identities as if they are real, as you said, psychologically, emotionally, and so on, is that you get colored study.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. We also have a question from Dr. Nicola Barsdorf. Nicola said, Professor Jansen, if we are able to recognize that how we talk about race within the institution more broadly is problematic, then how much of the responsibility should fall on the HRECs to be the gatekeeper of the use of race in research versus the institution itself taking responsibility for training all researchers in the appropriate use of race for research? HRECs are.
That's a very important question. So, I mean, the HRECs, you are sitting ducks as HRECs if you're the only people doing this kind of deliberation. You're sitting ducks, right? Because you have no power, as Ilana said. So the very important thing here is to make sure that the executive of the university, the leadership of the university, is 100% behind you, not just to have your backs politically, because trust me, the people in the health sciences, for example, in anatomy, and they think I'm a close relative of the devil, you know, simply for pointing out that you can't study the bones of deceased people who were found on the streets and say colored people have these diseases, etc. So you've got to have I don't need the defense, but you need it, right? The second is to do these kinds of presentations to the executive. There's some new members, some younger members of the leadership. I think Professor van der Villiers is a very wise and open vice chancellor, so I'm quite positive about that. But make sure that they make these points at every Senate meeting. Make sure that they make these points at a council. Make sure that when the rector or the new vice rector research, Sibu, Moyo goes around to the faculties that they make these points. You know what I mean? There has to be an overlap of effort. Otherwise, they leave you as a REC exposed.
Thank you very much. Professor, from my side, I mentioned it a little bit earlier as well, that what do we do with our researchers who are still, as you said, embedded in a conservative community, who hold these views? How do we overcome that? I mean, as a HREC, we obviously try as much as we can, but how do we change that culture? How do we get our researchers in a conservative place like Stellenbosch to think more broadly about these things?
In the short term, your options are limited. But you can do some things. One of the groups you must present, once you have those guidelines, if you follow that route, is to have a meeting of all your deans and all your HODs. Okay. And if it's too many of them, you split them up into 3 or 4 groups. And you go through this so that you begin to develop the understanding of what is appropriate and what is not. Because most of our colleagues in the natural sciences have never heard of race being a social construct. They actually think it's real. And even you're lucky if you have a junior class in theology. You're lucky, if you have, Safas van der Berg in economics. But by and large, people's thinking is tied up with how they were reared and so on. So bring your HODs and your deans so they can't say they didn't know. Okay, because you're quite right. As a HREC, you have no oversight over what people actually do in research once you've given approval. And then, but in the longer term, you have to make sure that you broaden the base of academics and academic researchers that you bring into the university from as many different universities, many different countries as possible, because over time you have a much broader, intellectual community than one that simply has people who did all the degrees at Stellenbosch.
Wonderful. I definitely support you in that. Professor Len Hansen has his hand up. Len, over to you.
Thank you, Lana, and thank you very much, Professor Janssen, and especially for those very practical suggestions as to what the HREC can do. I just want to make a comment, and this refers to back also to what you've said, about how we train people and what we can do. It also refers to Dr. Swart's question regarding, what can be seen as the ethics of research versus the ethics of publication. What do you do with and how do you present your research? And I don't know whether this is the case in many other RECs in our other institutions, but in our humanities, let's call it humanities REC, we have a 2-level system where everything where all applications have to go first via the department, and then or the faculty, where they have a research ethics, a clearance score, a screening committee, and then it goes on to only the medium risk studies are reviewed by the at the monthly REC meeting. The low risk studies has to be ratified by one member of the research committee. And I think, in that sense, the REC's thinking might also rub off or might also influence, over time, the view of colleagues in different departments and different faculties. Because if we ratify a low risk study that has issues or categories of race, or when we question that, then hopefully the message also goes back. But again, the desk or the FESC process again shows, as you rightly said, that in some environments there's very little understanding of the social construction of race, and I think there the ethics committee has a role to play. The other comment that I want to make is, besides for the REC, where for the desks or the departmental committees, where they sometimes say, but look, this is the way in which we do research in our faculty, and sometimes then they give or in our discipline, and then they would give explanations for their use of race. There's also, of course, in this specific, there are also other almost safety nets in the whole process. Most of our applications are from masters and PhD students, and all of those have to pass the departmental or the faculty research committees to get approved. So in that sense, also the education task you know, it would make the responsibility or the job of the RECs much easier if already in those discussions these issues are raised. And in the case of the coloured women article, such concerns apparently were raised within the faculty, or there was a bit of discussion and differences of opinion there. And then, of course, we also have the review for publication. But as we've seen with this article, also that in that sense, it's not foolproof. And as we all act as reviewers of articles, I think then the responsibility is also, you know, to take this understanding or misconceptions about race into those roles that we play also outside of our RECs. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Hansen. Yeah, you know, I agree with you. And listen, I think it is important to have all those safety nets, but in the intellectual community, dispersed across several campuses from here to Tygerberg to Saldanha, trust me, bad things will slip through. And therefore, the best chance you have of doing this, in addition to those networks you talk about, the safety nets, is education. You know, and I've been pushing, as you might have seen in the Compare Pair report as well, I've been pushing to sort of say, give every first year student a compulsory course that covers issues of race, identity, history, technology, and so on, so that they are educated before they are trained. And so you begin to build up this broader understanding. I mean, a lot of this has its roots, not just in society, but in the way we train our students. So an engineering student only learns engineering. You know, an American student only learns medicine, which is so dangerous. Because, as I said, they haven't had this broad education that would have included things like this, you know, etc. And yes, the thing, you have to do that for the academics of our university as well, because don't assume. You know, I mean, I'm amazed at the power, the intellect of academics in people like Elmarie Constantius, people like Sandra Swart, etc. But they are a minority of people because of their broader exposure to the world, who are able to understand what is happening here. And so you don't just have to do this for REC members in the different faculties, your reps, you also have to do this for academics in every department.
Wonderful. Professor Jansen, we have a question here or a comment by Dr. Berger. We are frequently asked as researchers by international reviewers to include race as a variable to try and explain research findings in the surgical sciences. Yeah, what do we do with those?
No, the medical sciences across the world, I was having this discussion, in fact, after the work study with Professor Van der Villiers, who, as you know, is a gastroenterologist. And he was off to a conference, a conference of urologists in Los Angeles or someplace at the time, and he showed me the conference proceedings. It was like a lot of South Africans were there, you know, because these Americans and others were talking about, you know, diabetes and race, you know, hypertension and race and so on. So I understand completely what Professor Berger is saying, that in the rest of the world, and the Americans are very much like us. And remember, this is where the syphilis experiments happen. This is where, to this day, you know, their race and disease are so clearly profiled. And I think it is our responsibility as people of conscience that when somebody asks me to do that, is to, if you do go that route, to have at the very least a footnote that says, this is how I'm using race. I'm not using race here in order to infer, you know, an essential connection between a classification and so on, but something that qualifies the use of race so that its social constructedness is understood and that people don't read race off a diseased body. That is, if people insist on those classifications.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Colleagues, do we have any questions from the floor? If you could just raise your hand, I can direct you to a question. We have a few in the comments. Dr. Berger, do you want to perhaps switch on your microwave? Your microphone, I mean, your microwave is something else. Looks people are very shy. So it's you and me. Oh, she can't. Oh, I see.
I can quickly switch it on. Sorry, I'm just trying to find Dr. Berger. Just give me a moment.
Wonderful.
Dr. Berger, please go ahead.
Thank you, Clarissa, and thanks, Prof. Jansen, for a very insightful talk. So I was actually just responding to Dr. Swart in the chat, where he was making the point that it's really difficult for HREC members to determine the value in research, for example, the pelvic muscle muscle strength. And I was making the point that that could be a potentially a risk factor for complications during childbirth, and that is, probably what this study was said. But it's really difficult for us as non-expert to determine. We're based, as Dr. Swart was saying, we base our decisions on the validity of research, on the literature review that is presented. But as non-experts in the field, it's often very difficult to determine, how valid is it to use, for example, race. But I really like the qualification that you proposed. I mean, when we are asked for adding race as a variable in our studies, we have this paragraph that we respond to reviewers saying race is a social construct and it doesn't contribute any value, and there is no value in adding this as a risk factor. It's always been accepted. What I wanted to point out that is, it's something that's internationally very, very frequently asked. I mean, this year alone, we've been asked at least 3 times to add race as a variable, whereas we thought it was completely inappropriate. So yeah, just my thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And again, especially if it comes from the Americas, remember we have very similar histories of slavery and colonialism and the racism, right? That puts us in that common sense paradigm that I spoke about. So I know that because I deal with that there. Let me also just say I can only assume that look, obviously I've left university administration, but if you ask me to be if I were part of your committee, I would insist that on the institutional end, I would have people there from medicine. I would have people there from engineering. Who have an understanding of what we're talking about. Okay, it won't be easy to find those people, but I think I've converted 1 or 2 of my colleagues over there who have been friends for many years, and put them there, because you're right. If you're a psychologist, you can't speak about cardiothoracic surgery, with any authority, and so on and so forth. But having that mix of people, by the way, this, where this also showed up as a huge problem, and we've written about this recently, is when the Coronavirus Command Council was constituted mainly by people from infectious diseases and vaccinology. And that is why we borrowed stupid ideas like social distancing, as if everybody lived in a big house with 4 rooms and adequate space. And so what did you do when people in Alex were walking outside? We literally beat them up, the police, to sort of get back into your shack. But the shack is overcrowded. So we asked the ironic question in the Cycling Journal of Science the other day. Shabir Mahdi and I edited a collection on how do you do social distancing in a shack. Now, the only way you could have understood the sociological dilemma is if the range of expertise on that authority included people from the social sciences. And that surely has to be true of the HRECs as well.
Thank you very much. We have one last question from Dr. Swart, Herman Swart. You're on.
Good morning, colleagues. Yeah, Prof. Jansen, I worry about a situation where we impose our own ideas of what is and is not meaningful on the applications that we receive. For example, we might have the idea that because race is socially constructed, that it adds no value, as Dr. Berger mentioned. But in some circumstances, the social construction of race adds very important value. If I self-identify as a member of a particular group and therefore position myself in relation to members of other groups who I may regard as superior or inferior to my group, then this can have very real consequences for how I engage with those individuals, for decisions I make, for policies I might support. And so I think just because you know, there might be an opinion that social construction, you know, means that race is irrelevant. I think we need to be careful of then, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, you know, this shouldn't be studied, because it means that there are lived experiences of individuals who are being treated a particular way because of the groups they are perceived to belong to by members of other groups. And surely this is worth scientific research to understand, you know, the dynamics of these intergroup relations, for example.
Yeah, I don't think you were here for my talk, but I more or less said the same thing. In other words, that provided the necessary qualifications are made, that you know, we should invite studies that involve people's research of particular kinds of identities and so on. But I just want to go to the principle that I think you started with, which is one I share. We, an intellectual community, you cannot actually tell people what to do and what not to do, especially when it comes to the subject of research. So on that, broadly, we agree. But I don't have to supervise your study if you show up with something about, you know, the drinking habits of colored school principals, first of all. And by the way, these are actually real studies, not from our university, from up north. Okay, now if you come to me with that kind of shit, of course I'm going to tell you I'm not going to study it, but I can't tell you that you can't do it. You know, if you find somebody willing, that's fine. But I do have a responsibility at Stellenbosch as a member of the Senate, as a member of the intellectual community, to sort of say, here's some guidelines, not rules. Here's some guidelines for how to think in doing that research that exposes you as a researcher and the student to less risk, okay, rather than to more risk. I mean, if you think of the damage done, particularly to the young researchers on Professor de Blanche's team, it destroyed them. It destroyed their family lives, their personal lives. That is the danger. Quite apart from the fact that it affected colored women, it also affects these young people trying to build their careers. So there are real costs, you know, to not being cautious in how. So I have seen studies, for example, on coon carnivals, but it is critical studies of coon carnivals. It's not taken, it doesn't take it at face value. It engages those kinds of difficult issues with a critical lens. So you're not scrumming away from the topic. You're simply looking at it through a different theoretical lens. That's why I said this is a bit more complicated. I said to Clarice, I wish we could do this face to face, because these are not the kinds of things you can talk on the screen. Anyway, on a lighter note, before I have to run to give a talk at the Brandvlei prison, can I just share a quick joke, please, Madam Chair?
Please.
There, in the context of what we're talking about, one of my favorite newspapers in the Cape is a very prestigious newspaper called The Voice. It's to publish every kind of nonsense, you know, get flats. But The Voice, every year with the Coon Carnival, there is a fight between the Coon Carnival clubs or whatever they are, and the city of Cape Town about which routes to take. And this particular year, I think Zilla was still the premier. The fights got quite bad between the carnival managers and the city of Cape Town. And The Voice had a big headline about this in December, and it said pre-menstrual tensions. And I thought that was funny.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Janssen, for your time and your very insightful comments, to everyone for the participation in this session. I'm announcing a 10-minute comfort break for everyone. We'll be back here in 10 minutes' time. Thank you very much, Professor Janssen, and best of luck for your talk in Brandvlei.
Thank you.